So in March, we had no idea what we were facing. We knew almost nothing about this disease. We didn't know well its transmission mechanism. We didn't know what the prevention strategies were that worked and that didn't work. We didn't know if you had to wipe off your groceries or not. There's been an enormous amount of science, and there's still things that we are learning, obviously, on a weekly and monthly basis. By the middle of the summer, it became quite clear that, at least as the science currently exists, if you are masked, if you're 6 feet apart, there's very little evidence of transmission. That gave us a pathway to say, all right, can we do that on campus, and how do we do it? We know a lot about sort of what type of cleaning you have to do, what type of cleaning solutions you have to use. So the knowledge that we've gained, I think, has gotten us quite a ways down the road that makes it much more possible to move towards this opening. And indeed, we've been opening labs all over the summer. So far, it's not that there aren't people on our campus community who have become ill, but of those who've become ill, we at least at present have no evidence that any of those transmissions occurred because of activities on campus.
Thanks, Chancellor. Perhaps another one for you. Obviously, those of us, everyone has been following the news closely, watching some of the challenges that other schools have had as they've reopened. Can you talk a little bit about what we're learning and what lessons we're taking from the experiences of some of those peer schools like UNC and Notre Dame?
So I don't know all of the protocols that those schools were following, but we do have quite a bit of information on some of their testing protocols. Both UNC and Notre Dame essentially didn't have very much testing at all. They were not doing surveillance testing. They didn't have testing sites available on campus for anyone to stop by. They weren't even testing in the dorms. So they had an explosion without, without having the information that you need if you're going to try to control it. And that gives me some hope that with a different and more expansive testing regime, we're going to be able to do some things that they weren't able to do. The other thing is, at least at UNC, is they hadn't set aside any isolation or quarantine facilities for their dorm residents. And they suddenly had more people who needed them than they had available. We have been quite explicit. In fact, in the middle of the summer, we doubled the amount of space available. We're using our conference facilities right now, which if we need them, they're there, and they're not being used elsewhere for other things. And we've actually signed some contracts with a couple of hotels in the area so that we have up to 1,000 spaces for isolation and quarantine for close contacts. If there is an outbreak in the dorms and we need to move some people into quarantine for a period of time.
Great, thank you. Maybe a question here both for you, Chancellor, and also for the Provost. If we did hit a point at which campus needed to modify its operations, would it be a full semester shutdown, or would you consider the possibility of a 2-week virtual quarantine period like we've seen some other schools?
So, some of this does depend upon the data that's coming in and what we're observing. If we observe a cluster of infections in a lab in the veterinary school, we're going to focus on the veterinary school and those labs and their operations and not affect other pieces on campus. If we have a more widespread problem with regard to students, we will focus on students and instruction. And as Steve mentioned, we hope that we don't have to pull the labs down in that case. Whether we would consider a 2-week shutdown or simply go all to online classes, I think that depends a lot on where you are in the semester and what it's looking like. It's going to be very hard for our faculty to be told in a very short period of time, now go online, but 2 weeks later we might come back in person again. That's just hard to deal with if you're trying to teach a coherent and consistent class. So, my guess is, if we do come to a point where we have to change what we're doing, we're likely to simply transition to online learning for the rest of the semester. But this is both a quantitative and a qualitative decision, and it is going to depend on what we're seeing and where we're seeing it.
I'll add just very, very briefly. I was on a call yesterday with provosts from around the country, and they expressed a fair bit of skepticism about the efficacy of 2-week break. Since students are still on campus, they're still in their living arrangements, and there's even less structure going on. But one of the advantages of being a little bit behind other institutions in the academic calendar is we can learn from them. We can learn from Notre Dame and how successful their 2-week break is. We can learn from the University of Maryland and see how that has gone for them. But the other important point that the chancellor's mentioned, but I want to reinforce, unlike March, our decisions to scale back doesn't have to be that 0-1. We can scale back selectively in different parts of campus. So it's very important, for instance, for our students to do a clinical education to be able to pursue that education to make timely progress to degree. So unless it's absolutely essential to shut down that aspect of the educational enterprise, we likely won't. Similarly, as the Chancellor and Steve Ackerman have mentioned, we have very successfully reintroduced a lot of research onto campus. It doesn't seem necessary, depending on the patterns that we see, to necessarily shut down all of that activity that we've been successfully doing all summer. And so we will be, how do I want to say it, more flexible in how we proceed in the fall if a change of course is needed.